Hey, what is up guys, it's RB and Hardware. In today's video we're gonna build the best gaming PC under $500 you can get in December of 2020. Now we're gonna go over the whole building process from start to finish. We're then gonna fire up the PC and we're going to look at what kind of frame rate you can expect in case you decide to build this PC. Now if you find anything you like, all items are linked up down below. Now at $412 to be specific, you'll be able to run most games in 60 FPS and 720p, and in a lot of games you'll be able to bump up the resolution to 1080p and still average 60 FPS, which is just insane knowing that we're only spending a bit over $400 for the entire PC build. Anyway, inside this particular PC we have an AMD Ryzen 3 3200G processor. This is a high clocked 4-core APU that is based on AMD Zen Plus and Vega graphics architecture, so you're getting a graphics card plus a CPU that's capable of running most games with respectable frame rate, all in one package for $99. Now to get as much graphics performance as possible at this budget, we're gonna pair the APU with these 16GB DDR4 memory sticks from Corsair, and the way that these APUs work, they share the video memory from our DDR4 RAM for our system memory, so by opting for faster RAMs we can get more FPS in our favorite game. I recommend going for at least 3200 MHz RAMs, but if you can afford it, you wanna jump on 3600. Trust me guys, you will thank me later. Anyway, I only had 3200 MHz RAMs laying around, so that's what we are testing out today. But just a quick look at CSGO running in 1080p with low settings. We are averaging 140 FPS, and if you want to go for that competitive frame rate, you can drop the resolution down to 720p and you will see over 200 FPS here. Anyway, for the rest of the system we find a 500GB SSD, all contained in this awesome high airflow Cooler Master case. If you're only here for a specific part of this video, you'll find timestamps down below. But before we get started, be sure to drop a comment, let me know what you thought about this PC build, drop a like if you enjoyed the content, and make sure to subscribe to never miss an episode. So with that said, let's start with our motherboard coming in at $63. This is the Gigabyte B450M DS3H. This is a highly reliable and powerful B450M motherboard, and it comes with everything you would expect, plus a few extra features that will make this board a bit more future-proof, like 4 DIMM slot with dual channel support, so you can add another 16GB of RAM if you want later on. We also find 8 USB ports, 4 SATA ports, as well as an M.2 slot, plus an HDMI and a DVI for display output. For our processor, I chose the Ryzen 3 3200G. It has 4 cores and 4 threads with the base clock at 3.6 and 4 GHz turbo. Now this 4-core APU chip offers fantastic gaming performance for its price tag, and it can run many modern games and upcoming games at 720p. But in many cases, you're able to run your favorite game at 1080p with low settings and good frame rate. Now installing the processor is super easy. You wanna locate the golden triangle, and this golden triangle lines up with a triangle on our motherboard socket, so you simply wanna turn the CPU so that the triangles match up. You wanna open up the metal arm, then drop the processor into the socket, you put the metal arm down, and our CPU is now installed. Now inside the CPU box we also find a heatsink, and if you aren't interested in doing heavy overclocking, the included stock cooler is actually more than enough. And this is what the system sounds like running CSGO at low settings in 1080p. The cooler installment is pretty simple. As we can see, our motherboard comes with something called retention frames pre-installed, but since we're using a cooler with springs rather than retention clips, we need to remove the retention frame from the motherboard, and we do so by unscrewing the 4 screws holding it in place. With the retention frame removed, we ensure that the backplate remains in position with the holes on the motherboard. Now if this is the first time you're installing the CPU cooler, it may already have some thermal grease pre-applied, and in that case you don't need to apply thermal grease on the CPU lid. Now you want to position the CPU cooler so that the 4 spring screws on the heatsink align with the 4 screws on the backplate. Once aligned, carefully place the heatsink onto the CPU. Using a screwdriver, turn each spring screw half a turn clockwise to ensure the spring screw makes a connection with the backplate. Follow a diagonal pattern across the CPU cooler, further tightening each spring screw with the full turn. With all the spring screws connected to the backplate, you want to tighten them up until you feel resistance. Then you want to check the CPU cooler to ensure that it's properly secured to the motherboard. Lastly, you need to connect the fan power cable to the CPU fan header on the motherboard. Now we're almost done. The only thing missing is our RAMs, and for today's build I ended up picking these top of the line, highly popular 16GB Vengeance LPX RAMs from Corsair. Now 16GB is more than enough for modern gaming, and it was only a year ago that Bunch Games started to recommend that you had 12GB RAM installed. Now this 3200 MHz kit I chose for this build will give you a bit more of a frame rate boost versus using a slow clock RAM, as the way that the 3200G APU work, having faster clock RAM can gain a bit of performance in your favorite game. But again, if you can find the 3600 MHz kit and you can afford it, you definitely want to pull the trigger on that one. Anyway, simply pull back the clips for the second and the fourth DIMM slot and simply plug them in just like so. Very easy, and now we can finally begin the real fun by installing the motherboard in our chassis. And for today's build, we're gonna go with the Cooler Monster Masterbox MB320L, coming in at just $59. Now this might be the best and cheapest MATX case with high airflow on the market. It comes with dual 120mm ARGB fans, which will keep your system cool and quiet, and in case you decide to upgrade to a dedicated graphics card later on, you will have plenty of air blowing over that GPU. In the front we find honeycomb mesh intakes on either side of this so-called dark mirror front panel. This dark mirror front looks very stylish, but in case you want optical airflow, Cooler Monster also sells a similar front in mesh instead of this dark mirror, and you find that case linked up down below. For I/O, for ports in the front we find 2 USB 3.0, reset and a power button, as well as mic in and audio. There's room for a 240 radiator in the top and a 280mm radiator in the front. There's also room for 2 SSDs and 2 hard drives. Lastly, the case comes with a tempered glass side panel. And guys, I gotta be honest here, I had so much fun building in this. Cooler Monster, what an awesome budget PC case this is. Anyway, let's install a motherboard. So in order to get access to the inside of our chassis, all we need to do is untie these 4 thumb screws that holds the tempered glass in place. Now by having the CPU fan already installed, we can just grab on to the CPU cooler and gently slide the motherboard into place, and this can be done either by having the case standing up or laying down. I actually prefer having it laying down. Now we need to secure the motherboard, and we're using the screws that comes provided from Cooler Monster. With the motherboard secured, before we install our power supply and storage, I figured this would be a good time to install our chassis cables that takes care of the front audio, USB, as well as the power button. Let's start with the USB 3. This is a white connector and it's fairly thick and it is almost impossible to miss. Simply route it through one of these various routing holes and plug it in just like so. The connector is located at the bottom of the motherboard. Next up we got front audio. Now this cable goes to the left side corner. Lastly, before we're done, we got the front panel connectors, and you find these on the lower right side. These can be a bit tricky guys, but just take your time here. For our power supply for today's build, I chose the Corsair CV 550W unit. This is a high quality power supply that got 80 plus bronze efficiency certifications with sleeved cables and a price tag coming in at just $58. Now, as we are installing this, you want to make sure that you got the fan facing downwards, then you gently slide it into place and secure it. There are a couple of cables here we're gonna need. First up, we got the 24-pin power for the motherboard, and this one goes to the connector on the mid left side. Next up, we got the 8-pin power for our CPU, and this one goes all the way up to the top left side corner. Now it is time to install our SSD, and for this build I ended up picking the Kingston A400 with 480GB of storage. Now this may seem a bit low for a PC in 2020 and in 2021, however I still think this is the only option to go for at this strict $400 budget. A mechanical spinning hard drive is also an option here, however while that gives you more storage, your system will also feel a lot slower and less snappy versus, let's say, if you went for an SSD. Now a 480GB SSD is enough to feed a few games, and you can always upgrade to more storage later down the road, as the case has room for 2 mechanical hard drives in the front and another SSD that can be installed in the case as well. You also have the option of installing a M.2 on the motherboard. So let's install our SSD, and we're gonna use one of these 2 SSD spots here we find on the back. We're gonna need these 4 rubber washers and these 4 short stubs, which we screw into our SSD. This stuff, guys, comes provided from Cooler Master. We push the rubber washers into these holes, and now we can just slide the SSD into place just like so. We'll plug in the SATA cable that comes with our Gigabyte motherboard, as well as the SATA power connector coming from our power supply. Simply route the SATA cables through one of the routing holes and plug it into the motherboard. Now we have reached the point where we typically install a graphics card, but since our graphics chip is built into our processor, we don't need to worry about that. Now there's only one tiny thing left before we can turn on our system. Because our motherboard doesn't have support for addressable RGB out of the box, we're gonna have to add this so-called ARGB controller, otherwise we won't have any RGB at all. So we simply plug the RGB fan connector to the RGB hub. We then find a free SATA power connector from our power supply. We plug it in, and we are now officially done. Now we just flip the case around, we put the tempered glass side panel back, and we have officially completed our $400 gaming PC build. So let's turn on our system and see how it performs. Now for the very first time we boot up our system, you want to double check that our RAM sticks are running in its so-called XMP profile. Now to do so, upon startup you want to tap delete while seeing the Asus ROG logo, and once inside you want to navigate to something called AI Tweaker, and under AI Overclock Tuner in the drop down menu you want to select DOCP, and that will automatically load the XMP settings for our RAMs so that they can run in their advertised speed. You want to save all the changes and you're good to go. So what we see when we're testing the 3200G is that in a lot of games in 1080p you're actually getting respectable frame rate. And first up we got CSGO, and for this title I went with 1080p with competitive settings, and this gives us an average well over 130 FPS again in 1080p, whereas in 720p you're gonna see frame rates over 200 FPS on average. Far Cry New Dawn, however, falls a bit behind. This has much to do with the game engine, where we know that this one likes cores and threads, and this is where CPUs like the 3200G, who only has 4 cores, is going to bottleneck the performance. Division 2 is up next, and here we see a much healthier numbers, almost 50 FPS in 1080p, and with a bit of overclock here you're gonna see numbers close to the magic 60 FPS mark. Shadow of the Tomb Raider we saw almost 60 FPS in 720 and about 35 FPS in 1080p, so almost 50% reduction going from 1080p to 720, and so a bit of a disappointment for sure. Grand Theft Auto 5, however, runs great on the 3200G with over 70 FPS at 1080p and almost 100 FPS in 720, which is just fantastic results for this $99 dirt cheap APU. World War Z is yet another game where we saw fantastic numbers, almost 60 FPS and 1080p. Fortnite also did great. I went with a mix between low and competitive settings here, so viewing distance set to 4 and 3D models set to 70 or 80%, results in about 60 FPS on average and 1080p. However, if you do decide to drop the settings to the lowest, you'll see numbers close to 3-digit mark in 1080p and 150 FPS and 720. Apex Legends also runs great if you're willing to bump the settings down to 720p. 1080p might also be possible if you do some overclocking. And again, all PC components can be found down below, guys. Now, I am starting up a Discord server and it would be fantastic if you guys wanted to join the awesome community and start discussing PC builds and issues and everything in between. Now, I'm going to hang out there and I'm going to answer any questions you guys might have, so definitely join the Discord server. You'll find the link down below. Now watch either of these two videos and I will see you guys in the next video.